and I'll be your meeting moderator. We appreciate your attendance, and we have a team of people here. As you can see, the title slide says question and answer session. This is not a typical meeting where we spend the first hour explaining the project and then go into Q&A. We have done a series of these meetings. This one is the third meeting. We held a meeting in December and then one again last month in January, and now our third session here tonight. We have assumed that people who are joining us are somewhat familiar with the project. You were mailed a newsletter. Some people have already participated in a couple of our surveys. And if you have not yet done that, feel free to log out, maybe get familiar and log back in. This meeting is being recorded. And just like all the other meetings that we've been having, it is up in that virtual room at rwctransitplan.com. And also we did have some feedback from some folks that they do prefer to have the more traditional website. And so the materials that we are referencing are also on the city's website, where you can just go onto the Redwood City website and look for the Caltrain grade separation study. And you should be able to find the pages that are more traditional in nature, where the materials are logged in more library style, like a typical project website. But I think you'll be excited if you have not yet had a chance to look at our virtual room to see all of the different things that are available in 3D and on videotape for you to get yourself up to speed. So the way the meeting is going to work this evening is we have the ability to have you type in questions in the Q&A function. You should be able to see that on the bottom of your screen. It looks like two thought bubbles and it says Q&A. If you click on that, you'll be given an opportunity then to use your regular computer keyboard to type in questions that I will be happy to read to our experts that are here and available to answer your questions this evening. As I've mentioned, we have had our website up for quite a while, as well as doing some other meetings on this topic. And we do have several questions that have come up and have consistently been of interest to the community. So I do have some questions in my hopper already just to get the meeting started. And we do have some prepared materials just for those first few questions to orient folks who maybe haven't had a chance to get as deeply involved with the website or the materials, so we can get those folks up to speed. And then I will be going back and forth with our live questions, as well as some questions that, as I said, have come in through the chat function of the website itself. There's a place to be able to leave comments, and we have harvested those, including some that we were able to pull in even as early or as late as today. So our team is prepared to answer those live. And this meeting, as I mentioned, is going to be archived, as the other meetings have been on the website. So this meeting is scheduled to last about an hour and a half. But of course, if we don't fill the time, we will be adjourning a little ahead of that. Due to the city schedule, we will not be able to say too much after our 6:30 deadline, but we don't have to have a hard stop. If people are mid-question, we certainly will be doing our best to accommodate those last few questions if we get a lot of questions this evening. So again, thank you for joining us. Please feel free, if you do not ask a question tonight, but you think, oh my gosh, I wish I would have asked that. We'll be showing you a place on the website, as I mentioned, where you can leave a comment. And if you haven't had a chance to do so, we do have a live survey that we'll be showing you how to access that talks about the various alternatives that we'll be going through this evening. And we would love to get your feedback. We've been so fortunate to get nearly 100 surveys finished already. And this survey will be live through the rest of the month. And we appreciate it if you'd share that information with your neighbors, with your colleagues, or with your family members to make sure everybody has a chance to take that survey and let their opinions be known. We will be covering some more schedule information as we get to some of the questions. So I'm really more here to just let you know how the meeting's going to go, and the fact that, as I said, we're being recorded. You probably will want to know, if I do share this information, how quickly will the recording of tonight's meeting be available? We're finding that it takes about a week for that to appear on the city website. So please don't look for it tomorrow. This meeting will be up a week from today. And if you would like, the ones from the session that I mentioned in December and January are already up on the website, and we'll show you where you can access those. So I think I've oriented everybody as best I can on the topics that are there. If somebody has a question about what I call housekeeping items, happy to take that. And I'm just going to get straight into our questions for the team. Let me explain too that in previous meetings, we were lucky to have city staff as well as project consultant team engineers with us. Tonight, we've added an additional resource that was a person not doing a lot of question answering in the previous meetings, and that's our traffic expert. So we fully expect, since there's been new traffic information posted online, we expect and hope that that will generate some traffic related questions that might have inspired people to ask some deep dive questions. So we have Bill here available for those. So as I ask questions of folks, I'm going to introduce them as they start answering, so you get a chance to place some names with some faces and their job functions, so that it makes sense of why they are answering the questions. And just one more thing, because you can see here it says Caltrain grade separation study. We do have Caltrain staff here this evening as well to take those questions that are related to the Caltrain service and their business planning and things that definitely relate in with this project. So we have Caltrain, we have the city, we have the project team, and we specifically have a traffic expert this evening. So hopefully we can cover all the questions that you might type in our chat box. And I see that we already have a question coming in. So this is fantastic. So right away, I'm going to just hit it right off the top, and I'm going to have Jessica Manzi, who is the transportation manager for the city's Public Works and Community Development Department. And she's going to take our first question, which is, why is this project needed? So Jessica, if you could give us some background on why the city is undertaking such an effort.
Thanks, Eileen. Sure. So a grade separation project in Redwood City is going to reduce the barrier that's currently created by the railroad tracks and create opportunities for increasing transit service on the Caltrain corridor. Grade separations generally increase connectivity and safety, and they can reduce congestion and train horn noise. As you can see in this slide, which is a map of Redwood City zoomed in a little bit more on the downtown, each of those dots and shaded areas is a planned or potential development project. So you can see there's a lot of activity in Redwood City in general, but also particularly next to the train tracks. And so we want to make sure that in order to preserve our ability to build a grade separation in the future, that we're taking into account how much space we need so that development doesn't limit our options for building a project like this. So with the ongoing development near the tracks, we also want to be able to minimize the total cost. So by identifying those space needs and not having to impact projects or buildings that have been recently built. Caltrain's board has adopted a service vision for 2040 that assumes a significant increase in the number of trains on the corridor. Next slide, Millette, which is illustrated here. And providing that level of service is going to require there be a 4-track hub station at the middle of the corridor. Downtown Redwood City has been identified as the location for this hub station, and the increase in trains will create additional delays for crossing the tracks if they're left at grade, and separations would be needed where we will have 4 sets of tracks. So you can see in that graphic that there's going to be a really dramatic increase in the number of trains going throughout the day in Redwood City as well as during peak hours. And so grade separations will allow us to minimize those adverse traffic impacts on the community. And next slide. So what I'm going to do is take the opportunity to just share with you a little bit of the information that's on the in the virtual room, so that you know how to sort of navigate that in the future and can explore it on your own. So everybody should be seeing the virtual room. This is when I open up the virtual room window, this is the view that I see, which sort of orients you towards the left of the room and sort of more of the introductory material. So we have a welcome video talking about the transit district and the grade separation study from our mayor. There's a really helpful tutorial that's on this video. So if you just click the video, it'll open up a link to a YouTube video that explains how to navigate in the room. This is where we posted the last Q&A session recording, and here's where we'll have sort of upcoming dates for the project. And so then I'm just able to pan around in the room to see what else is going on. So these boards are also clickable. Click on one, pulls up lots of new information about the transit district. So you could do that for all of these boards. This is a really important spot here. This board you can click on to take the survey. If you click on that button, that'll take you to the survey. If you want to put your name on their stakeholder list, you can click here and provide the information there. Also really important is this board or this wall of videos on the right side of the room. So these are all videos explaining the different options for the grade crossings at each of the existing at-grade crossings, as well as some background information and an overview of the railroad alternatives that we're considering now as well. So if you don't like the idea of navigating this on your own, you just want somebody to give the information to you, just click on those videos and you'll get all of the material there. If you scroll sort of down, you can see that there's this table that has an aerial map of the rail corridor in Redwood City. So you've got San Carlos up here to the north, and then if you pan around, you get to Woodside Road here in the south. And each of the at-grade crossings is labeled with a green sign. And these blue markers you can click on to get more information about what options are being considered in each of those streets. And when you click on one of those options, it brings up more details. So lots of information that you can be gathering. If you click on the Caltrain symbol, that's where we have more details on each of the 4 alternatives that we're considering for the grade separations. This pink area is highlighting the transit district. So that's the sort of broader planning effort that we're doing right now, including both Caltrain and Samtrans properties, as well as the current Sequoia Station retail area. So that's high level what you can do. You can also, on these yellow buttons, you can click on those and that'll take you to the existing street view. So you can pan around and see what it looks like today if you're not familiar with a certain crossing. Here is where we have information on how the alternatives are being evaluated, where you can get information on traffic, as well as more background information that is sort of foundational for the work that we're doing today. And then one last plug, again, if you don't want to come in here and navigate to the board to get to the survey, you can also click on feedback as a way to get to that board as well. So that's a high-level overview of what's going on in the virtual room. Now I'll hand it back to you, Eileen.
Well, I've got you, Jessica. There is a question that's been typed in live. It says, please further explain in detail why more trains are anticipated. And I'm thinking that this, if you could go back to that slide you just used with the additional trains as a graphic. And then I think I might also throw it over to Melissa Rijardo with Caltrain to also add some additional information. But if you wanted to start, Jessica, and if we can have Millette pull up that particular slide just so that we have a visual for the folks. And for those of you who are joining, and several of you are joining, to ask a question live, you go to the Q&A function at the bottom. That's how we're taking our questions tonight. I do have several questions that have come in that we've harvested from the website. We'll be going through those, and then I'll do my best to feather in the ones that are coming in live right at sort of the appropriate time. We'll get to all the questions here this evening, but just wanted to let you know how that is working. So please.
Sure. So I'll start us off, and then as you mentioned, I think Melissa is going to give a little bit more background, but the growth in Caltrain service is really tied to this years-long planning effort to improve the train service along the whole peninsula. And this is, again, driven in part because of the extreme congestion that we were experiencing prior to the pandemic. I know a question that comes up a lot frequently is why we're planning on increasing train service when congestion has gone down and there's been a lot of changes to traffic patterns in response to the pandemic. And while that is very true, and we have seen changes to how people are getting around. We do expect in the lifetime of so how long it takes to build grade separation projects and get back to increase train service, we're easily talking 5-10 years. And in that time frame, we do expect that a lot of the patterns that we saw before the pandemic will come back, mostly because we know that our region really relies on people's ability to get around, whether that's going to work or visiting family or doing other trips, as well as to, people get their Amazon deliveries at their door. So there's a lot of trips being made for a lot of different reasons. And we don't expect that to necessarily change permanently.
Melissa?
Yeah, that was great, Jessica. Thank you. And if I could just add just a couple more details, what is the levels of train service that are shown here relate directly to Caltrain's service vision in 2040, which was derived from the Caltrain business plan, which was sort of a multi-year effort done alongside with many stakeholders such as Redwood City. And what that service vision entails is what we had called the moderate growth scenario, which is 8 Caltrain trains per direction per hour, in addition to 4 high-speed rail trains per direction per hour in 2040. So it's a very, very much a long-term vision. And the purpose of that is to really build off the investment that the region has made in the electrification of Caltrain. So you can see from this chart, just to add a little bit more detail, the moderate growth scenario, which is the adopted service vision, would account for 398 trains, whereas there's only 92 weekday trains per day today. Of course, that has been adjusted in the pandemic. And then, of course, I just want to note, the bottom of the slide shows that it could go as high as 478 trains. And I just want to put a finer note on that. That reflects the higher growth scenario that our board did not adopt, but they have asked us to attempt to not preclude those higher levels of train service in the future. So that doesn't necessarily mean plan for it, but consider it. And what we're really aiming for is that moderate growth scenario, is exactly what our board adopted through 398. So I hope that provides a little bit more detail on the basis of our work here.
And if somebody wanted to do a deep dive, would they go to the Caltrain website to look at the Redwood City business plan?
Yes, and from there they can find, if actually you just sort of Google Caltrain business plan, you'll get the business plan specific website, and I believe it's Caltrain 2040, but let me confirm that.
And I think we have the actual city one on one of our easels behind at the back of the room there, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, and so the specific website is, if you want to look at it now, caltrain2040.org.
Great, thank you. So this is back to the two of you again, Jessica and Melissa. So who is making the decision? We've got Caltrain's name all over the materials, but this is a city project. So Jessica, do you want to go through that?
Sure. So a technical advisory team from city and Caltrain staff has been working on this project since it started, and we're partnering with the Redwood City community to help the project team develop and refine the alternatives with the hope of getting to a preferred alternative. So one of the ways the community can provide their feedback is by participating in these sessions and also by completing the survey that Eileen, you mentioned earlier. And while the preferred alternative needs to meet Caltrain's design standards, it's ultimately up to the city and the city council to select our preferred alternative for a grade separation project. But because of the addition of the 4-track station in downtown, it's very much a joint initiative between ourselves and the Joint Powers Board.
Okay, thank you. We do have a question in the live chat. Why are the hosts and panelists the only ones to be able to see all the questions? Well, we're using the Q&A function tonight, which allows for the questions to go directly to the technical team versus the chat function where people get involved with talking to one another because we've been doing this, and we want to definitely pull the questions quickly so that we can get those questions answered. We do use the Q&A function, which is pretty typical of public meetings these days on Zoom. So this is a pretty standard operating procedure, and it's just how the Zoom function of Q&A works. And it was also so that we could get access to those questions and get as many in tonight as possible. That doesn't mean that you can't see these later, because we do keep a spreadsheet of everything and how the questions were answered, and those are posted online. And you will see those in the frequently asked questions. We've been updating those post every one of our meetings, so you can see the evolution of the questions and the answers. And so I just wanted to let that guest know what the answer to that question is. All right, now I want to get back to some of the questions that had come in online, and just some of the questions that orient the folks that are joining us maybe for the first time, which is, what's the schedule of this whole effort? And Jessica, I believe you're prepared to answer that one for us.
Sure. So given the cost and complexity of grade separations, they typically take 7 to 10 years to plan, design, and build. A project for a single crossing would be at the shorter end of that range, while a citywide project would be towards the longer end. That, of course, assumes that we have funding at each stage of the project. And we're at the very beginning of this process, where we're trying to determine if the project is feasible, and then if so, which grade crossings we want to separate and when.
Okay. All right, the next question has come in is, what are the alternatives being considered? And again, this is something to help orient folks. And I know, Millette, you're the leader of our AECOM consultant team. Can you go through that and get everyone up to speed on, when we talk about alternatives, what exactly are we talking about?
Yeah, we are studying for alternatives for the railroad alignment in general. And I'm going to walk through what the vertical profiles look like for the railroad for each of the 4 alternatives. And this view that you're seeing here, you need to imagine that you're standing on near El Camino, and you're looking toward 101. So you're going to be seeing the railroad tracks from the side. And this is the profile view that you could see. In this exhibit, the green dash line is the existing railroad profile, and then the red line is what we are proposing as the railroad profile. So as you can see, for alternative 1, we would be elevating the tracks throughout the city, as shown by the red line. This is considered a high cost alternative, but it would fully grade separate the most at grade crossings at once within Redwood City.
And also, if you would, Millette, also go through how high these are, if you could also cover that topic while you're doing these slides.
Yep, I will. Yes.
Thanks.
And then this is alternative 2. It's a bit less ambitious than alternative 1, and would elevate the tracks throughout the city in 2 phases. And the first phase would be Whipple, Brewster, and Broadway. And that's shown in the solid red line here. And then phase 2 would be the second phase, or the second phase, phase 2, would elevate Maple, Main, and Chestnut, and that's represented by the red dashed line in this graphic. In alternative 2, the Jefferson Avenue rail structure would also be raised in phase 1, which is a currently grade separated crossing right now. And then alternative 3 is very similar to alternative 2, except that the Jefferson Avenue, the raising of that structure, is moved to phase 2 rather than phase 1, as it was in alternative 2. And we have the same representation here of the solid red line being phase 1 and the dashed red line being phase 2. The last alternative that we're looking at, alternative 4, would be an elevated track at Whipple only, and this would require the closure of Brewster and Broadway at the railroad tracks as well. This is the least complex of complex of the alternatives and has no impacts at Jefferson. So Eileen asked me to kind of go through what the rail height differences are for each of the alternatives. So in this table, you will see the numbered alternatives on the left side, and then across the top is each of the cross streets. And the height of the railroad at each cross street for each of the 4 alternatives is summarized. And the rail height is the difference between the newer proposed tracks and the below cross street. So as you can see in the table, I mentioned alternative 1 elevates the railroad throughout the city. And as you can see for alternative 1, the height of the track varies from 23 feet at Whipple and then goes all the way to 6 feet at Chestnut. And the alternative 4, where we mentioned that that was only elevating Whipple Avenue, you can see that Whipple Avenue is elevated by 9 feet, but the elevation does not change for any of the other cross streets in that example.
Okay, Millette, well, I've got you here. There's some questions coming in live about the tracks and noise. So if I could read that, there's actually a part of the question, and then the same person put that same question into a longer question. So I'm gonna read the second one since it covers the first question that got typed in. If the tracks are elevated, the track noise will be louder near the tracks and noise will travel farther out to other parts of the city. How would that be mitigated? And also, would the elevated track be on a berm like in San Carlos, dividing the city visually? So there's sort of 3 questions here. One is, will the noise be louder near the tracks? And then how would that be mitigated? So those are 2 different questions. And then how would you be looking at putting things on a berm like San Carlos in all the options? And would that then divide the city? So a couple of different things for you to answer there, Millette. Thank you.
Yeah, I think I'll start with the second one first. We generally are saying that the track will be elevated, but we have not determined what would be on berm, which is a retaining wall with a fill structure, kind of similar to what you see through the San Carlos area. But there will also be opportunities to do a structure or a viaduct. And that's maybe more similar to what you may see in BART and Oakland and other areas where the track is elevated and on structure. So there will be opportunities to do some of both. Obviously, the elevating the track on structure is more expensive than on the berm. If we did have also areas where there was room to incorporate a fill slope rather than a retaining wall, we would try to take advantage of that. So those are details that we would be working out later on in the design. And this first part of the question that you asked was related to noise. I would say earlier in the presentation, there's been mention of the increase in service with the implementation of electrification. In general, that will be a huge improvement along the corridor in that, we would get rid of the diesel trains and that will significantly reduce the noise. With the introduction of the electric trains, it also changes where the sound comes from, because the sound actually comes from the wheels rather than from the upper part of the train like a diesel train does. So that will significantly reduce the sounds of the noise of the trains throughout the corridor, and ways that we can further mitigate that train noise from radiating out is we would implement parapet walls all along the elevated track to block the noise and keep it from radiating out. So, and these are all in the next phase of the project. Part of the environmental process will be evaluating the noise impacts, and that would be studied in much more detail at that phase as well.
Okay, thank you for that. So our next questions, we're going to move into a series of traffic related questions. And so I'm going to hand this over to our traffic expert, Bill. So if at grade crossings are being closed, which Millette went through as some of those options, how will the traffic patterns change, Bill? If you could give us a little tutorial on that. And then I've got some site specific questions that will follow up.
Thanks, Eileen, and good evening, everyone. So I put together a little summary here of how we look at traffic when we look at both grade separations and crossing closures. So this is a hypothetical street network, and the dashed red line in the middle is the rail right-of-way. And then you can see, of course, three crossings and then parallel streets to the railroad itself. And right now we're showing all three crossings have about the same amount of traffic in each direction. So then if we go to the next slide. When you close a crossing, what happens is you essentially eliminate all the through traffic. So the amount of traffic that's on the streets adjacent to the closure, then is only the traffic that's related to the specific uses that are on that short 1 block segment. And so the traffic on the street itself is reduced dramatically, but that traffic has to go somewhere. So the next slide shows what happens with that. So what occurs is what we call a traffic diversion. And the way we looked at this in our analysis is essentially what I would call the worst case. It's where people, when they're approaching the grade crossing, they wait until the very last intersection to turn to go to another crossing. So you can see with the arrows that people approaching from either side, they're turning either right or left to go to the adjacent crossing. So what happens is that the traffic volumes on the adjacent two crossings go up. What also happens is that the turning movements at the intersections nearby increase. So you end up with some changes in traffic operations because of this. Now in real life, it won't happen quite this way. It will be more dispersed. Just people, people learn. They learn that the street that they're on does not cross the tracks anymore. So they won't drive on that street. If they have an opportunity, they'll shift over to a street that does have a crossing, and they'll do that. Typically, they'll do that earlier rather than later. And so the way we did our analysis, actually, as I said, it's kind of a worst case because it assumes everybody waits till the very last minute to make that decision. And then the other part of this on the next slide is what happens when you have a grade separation. So it's kind of the reverse, is that by grade separating, you actually increase the ability of that crossing to accommodate traffic or increase the throughput. And you also tend to decrease the traffic on the other crossings. And the reason for this is that, for example, right now, between 11 and 12 minutes during the peak hour of traffic on a weekday, the gates are down, the crossing gates are down. And so there's traffic, waiting. And actually the amount of time that traffic is waiting and there's queuing occurring is actually more than 11 or 12 minutes. So if you think about it, you have 60 minutes in an hour, maybe as much as 25% or 20% of it is actually related to the train crossings that are occurring. So when you grade separate, you gain back all that time. And so you can move more cars through the crossing. And also people don't have to experience the delay. It's less delay. So traffic will be attracted to where there's a grade separation. So you have these two different kind of activities occurring when you have either crossing closures or when you grade separate. In our analysis that we did takes both of these into account.
Thanks, Bill. Now I've got a site-specific one, and the question is, what happens to the traffic if you close Broadway and/or Brewster? So if you could get a little bit more site-specific on that one.
Yeah, let's see. What I'm going to do is share my screen. Can I do that? Oops.
You should be able to. There you go. I see you.
Okay, now I have the virtual room here. Let me get it back.
And Peter can assist if you need to, Bill. Just let us know.
Oh, let's see if this works. Just let me know if you can see the virtual room.
I see the room, but I see you in it, so I'm not seeing it independent of you. So your screen's not really being shared. We're just looking at you.
Oh, that's because I'm
Start
not.
the screen share. Sometimes you have
Yeah.
to hit start.
Yeah, that would help, wouldn't it? There we go.
There, wait, maybe that'll work.
You find it there. Okay. Got it now?
Yes.
Okay. So as Jessica was showing you earlier, the traffic information is over here. And so click on it. Just to give you an idea of what's there, there's existing level of service information that we'll talk about in a second here. There's also information for the year 2045, so a projection of what might happen in the future. And then we also have information on the daily traffic. That's the amount of traffic crossing the tracks at the different locations. And then there's a set of graphics that looks at traffic patterns. Now, if we go to this first one, existing level of service, so there's a diagram here which will help answer this question about what happens when the with the various different alternatives. So the first one shows traffic in the all at grade situation. That's the existing situation. And we're showing the intersection here of Whipple, and then this is Brewster, and then Broadway. And we're showing traffic level of service, which just to refresh you on what that is all about. It's a ranking or a grading of the traffic conditions, with A being a very good condition, and then F being a very poor congested condition. So right now you can see most of the locations are C or D. This is in the AM is the first letter, and then PM is the second one next to it. So for example, at Arguello and Brewster right now, it's a C in the morning and a C in the afternoon. Right now, the worst location on this map is El Camino at Brewster, which goes to E in the morning and D in the afternoon. And then down below, let's see if I can, yeah, okay. Down below, you can see what happens with the alternative where you grade separate everything. And it has a fairly positive impact, as you might imagine, on traffic. So at the worst location, for example, it goes from an E before to a D in the morning, and then from a D in the afternoon existing to a C. So there's a fairly big improvement if you grade separate everything. Then if you go back here and we look at the option of Whipple and Brewster being grade separated, but closing Broadway. So from my discussion before, you have two different things going on. You're increasing the throughput at these two locations, Whipple and Brewster, but you're decreasing dramatically the throughput at Broadway. And so traffic is going to be diverted to these two locations. But generally, if you compare with the existing here, you can see that generally overall conditions are the same or even a little bit better than existing by doing this. In fact, fairly much improved at the worst location there at Whipple and El Camino. So overall, there would be an improvement in terms of existing conditions. And then the other option would be if you close both Broadway and Brewster, but you grade separated Whipple. Now, in this case, it's a little different conclusion because of the traffic being diverted from these two crossings. There's more traffic on Whipple and you can see the effect that that has. It actually goes to level of service F up here at Arguello and E and D at the other location. So there would be a deterioration in traffic conditions on Whipple, and there would also be increased traffic on Jefferson, which is just off the map here. So anyways, that's how that works. And I think that also answers the question about what happens if you close those two streets or if you grade separate.
Yeah, it does. Thank you, Bill.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Okay, so this next question that's come in is I think a little bit broader question. I'm going to throw it to Jessica, and maybe Bill, you can add if Jessica throws it back to you. But the question is related to what methods are being used to evaluate the traffic. And I think that's getting to, you know, the sort of the methodology. So Jessica, if you could take that one.
Sure. Thank you. So one question we've heard is just regarding the city's use of level of service analysis, which is what Bill was just talking about, versus the new standard for environmental analysis, which is vehicle miles traveled. And basically, they're just two different tools that we use for answering different questions. Right now, we really want to understand how the traffic operations, how each intersection around these grade crossings would operate differently if there's a grade separation that's built. And so the best tool for that is the level of service analysis that Bill was presenting. When we get to the environmental phase, assuming that we go to that step, then we would be doing both additional level of service analysis that looks at more intersections as well as interactions between adjacent intersections, as well as a vehicle miles traveled analysis that helps us understand if separating certain streets would actually increase the number of miles people are driving or decrease that. So there's more to come, but you know, fundamentally, we're trying to use the best tool to answer the questions that are being asked. And right now, we're really focused on how the local streets would be operating in response to a grade separation.
Okay, the next question's back to you, Bill. People are wondering where they can find more information on the traffic impact, some of the work that you've done. Can you show people where they could access that, please?
Yes, I think so. How do I get, let's see, how do I get back to the virtual room from here?
You can just X out.
Yeah.
Yeah, click the tab on the far left that says Redwood City, Bill, and that'll take you back to the room up higher.
The very top.
Oh, Redwood City, got it. Okay.
Yeah, there you are. And if you put X on that, you're back in the room.
Yeah.
On the X in the upper right corner.
Right of this blue box. You could be back with the map.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's covered up here. Let's see. I moved everybody. There we go. So yeah, you start. So it's at the far end of the room, and you go down where it says grade separation alternatives, and then evaluation matrix. But all the traffic information is here, and I'll just briefly explain what it is. The diagrams I was just showing you, these are level of service. These are for existing conditions. Then we have another set for future conditions. Those are important because, as it was explained earlier, there's going to be a fairly big increase in the number of trains. So the crossing times, the amount of time required for gates down at the grade crossings would increase quite a bit. And then looking at the average daily traffic, this shows you how much traffic would be crossing at each of the locations. And it's also interesting because you can see which streets get more traffic and which ones actually have a decrease in traffic under the different alternatives. And then the final one is a change in traffic patterns, which looks at on specific streets whether traffic would increase or decrease. One thing I'll say, and it sort of expands upon Jessica's response to the last question, is that this traffic analysis that we did here is a very high level analysis. It's really just to help the initial sorting through of the alternatives, so to see what are the differences with the alternative grade separations. It's not really a EIR level analysis. When the environmental document is done, there'll be a much more detailed analysis that'll look at a much bigger area and a lot more intersections, and also have a lot more detail. So this analysis wasn't designed to answer every single question. It was just designed to help differentiate between the alternatives.
Thanks, Bill. Bill, while you have the floor, I've got another specific question that's come in this evening. It says, hello, the Jefferson and El Camino intersection has always been graded in the lowest level of performance in the past EIRs. So how will this new project alleviate those issues? What do you anticipate the wait times to be for a left turn from eastbound Jefferson to northbound El Camino? Also, what will the city do to keep traffic from 280 to downtown off the side streets? What will the city do to combat increased traffic and issues that Upper Farm Hill Boulevard? I think they probably meant something that what will the city do to combat the increase in traffic on Upper Farm Hill Boulevard? So some of this I think is you, Bill, about the turning, and then probably Jessica to talk about what the city could possibly do related to this question.
Right. So when you think about Jefferson, going back to what we were talking about earlier, Jefferson is currently grade separated, and because of that, it attracts a lot of traffic. It's, people that know their way around know that Jefferson is the way to get across the tracks quickly and not to have to worry about being delayed by the trains. And so with these alternatives, when you add grade separations, you're going to create alternatives to Jefferson for people. So other routes that they could use where they won't experience the same amount of delay. On the other hand, when you do close a crossing, then some traffic is going to be diverted, and some of that will end up going to Jefferson. So there's kind of pluses and minuses as to how it will impact traffic on Jefferson itself. What I would say overall is that generally you're going to be better off with having grade separations versus not in terms of future traffic for the area, because if you don't, you're going to have the growth in traffic occurring, but you're also going to have the reduced amount of time to cross the crossing because of the increased number of trains. So just by their nature, the grade separations do mitigate traffic in the area. Now, the detailed thing about the amount of wait time for that particular turning movement, we don't actually have that information. That, as I said, we're not at that level of detail at this point. And to a certain extent, the same thing's true about the other questions about traffic on streets removed from this area. We didn't really look at that. We just looked at the specific area around the crossings. So I can't fully answer that question right now. I would say, though, it would be answered as we move forward into the further, more detailed studies and the environmental studies, and maybe Jessica could add to that.
Jessica, did you want to elaborate on any of that? And I'm certain that the city tracks that sort of thing, but did you want to talk about the tools in your toolkit?
Yeah, I mean, I really think Bill nailed that. I think the key is that more grade separations will provide more opportunities for people to get across the tracks more easily, which sort of decreases the need for people necessarily to be on Jefferson. So I don't see the project as really generating more demand on Jefferson for traffic. But like Bill said, during the environmental analysis for a grade separation project, we would be looking at sort of a wider scope of potential traffic impacts associated with the project to answer any sort of unintended consequences questions.
And would that cover the Farm Hill question that's been in this question as well?
Yeah.
All righty, thank you. Well, I've got you there. Got a question here is why not just do build number 4? It seems to be the easiest. So thoughts on that, Jessica? Why not? Why are we going through all this if that one's so easy?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't say that any of these are easy, but certainly it's the simplest one, perhaps. So the the city's interest in grade separations really started with the Whipple crossing, because that Whipple Avenue carries the most traffic. There have been the most crashes around there, and there's just the most interest within the community of addressing the challenges.
Bill, if we could get you to stop sharing also, looks like
Excuse me.
magical things are happening. If we could get you to stop sharing so we can share the another screen. Thank you.
So Whipple. So all of the alternatives include Whipple, because that's basically our highest priority. But what we were finding when we were doing this analysis is, with the 4-track station downtown, we have to close the Broadway and Brewster crossings if we had 4 sets of tracks, or we would most likely be closing those. We don't think that the California Public Utilities Commission would ultimately approve having a street cross 4 sets of train tracks. It would just be very difficult to make that safe. And so if both Broadway and Brewster were closed to vehicles, a lot of those cars would end up going to Whipple. So whatever benefit we had from a traffic perspective by separating, Whipple is now eliminated by those cars that are being diverted to Whipple now. So at the end of the day, like, alternative 4 is really not looking like it meets sort of the vision that the city and the community has for grade separations.
Okay, thanks. Now I'm going to throw one to Peter. Peter is part of the team, and he's somebody who's delved deep into the engineering aspects of things. So I'm hoping you can help these people understand the difference between options 2 and 3. So I think if you could go through that one more time. I know Millette did, but we're still having some questions about what are the real nuances between those 2 alternatives.
Yeah, thanks, Arlene. I'm sharing my screen now. Let me know if you could see it.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. So I'm going to expand a little bit on what Millette talked about earlier when she described the 4 alternatives here. We're looking at alternative 2, shown here in red, with the rail beginning its elevation gain just a little bit north of Cordilleras. And then the phase 1 is shown here in the solid red, and then it ends here just north of Main Street. So really what this alternative did was it answered the question of what could we build in the northern segment of the city without impacting the streets in the southern segment of the city. So it's essentially a modification or a take on alternative 1. So it grade separates as much as we can, but only in the northern half of the city. So what this does, and again, Millette touched upon this briefly, is that it requires a rebuild of the Jefferson Avenue structure, because we would be raising the tracks over Jefferson about 10 feet. So what alternative 3 did here, and let me bring up this next PDF, I'm going to overlay the 2 on top of each other. What alternative 3 does is it answers the question of, well, what could we build in the northern half without impacting Jefferson in phase 1? So this is why we show a slightly different profile here. It's essentially the same in the northern segment. Let me try to click here, bear with me. It begins roughly a little bit north of Cordilleras, but instead of ending at Main Street, it ends here just north of Jefferson. So it doesn't impact the bridge at Jefferson in phase 1. So there's, as you can see here, there's really some subtle differences in the elevations of the 2 at the various streets. The red, or alternative 2, the rail would be raised higher at Brewster and Broadway, but it would actually be lower at Maple and Main. And at Whipple and Chestnut, the 2 are essentially the same. So that's really the origins, if you will, of alternatives 2 and 3.
Okay, thanks, Peter. And since I've now got a question that sounds very engineering, I'm going to keep you with a live mic there and ask this question. Why are the bridge depths so large? This person is saying that they are positing could save significant money not having to lower roads and approaches so much if a more efficient bridge design is used. Also, should increase the track grade at the south end to gain additional height quicker. This will help at Main. should close and reroute Maple to Elm to get to Main to avoid any need to lower Redwood Creek, which would be extremely costly and problematic from a drainage standpoint. So I know there's quite a few things in there, Peter, but hopefully you can help shed some light on that one.
Yeah, that was a three-parter. Let me see if I can answer the first part first. The structure depth question. We established design criteria at the beginning of the project, and basically what we established was we took 10% of the span length would be established as the top of rail to the bottom of the structure or the soffit to establish our road profiles of how much we'd have to lower the road profiles. That's a little bit conservative, but it's really pretty close to being accurate. I mean, we're using 10%. So for example, if we had a 100-foot span over Brewster or over Whipple, for example, then we would use 10 feet between the proposed top of rail and the soffit. If we had, let's say, two spans, I think we have two spans at Whipple, let's say one span was 70 and another span was 50, we'd use 10% of the longer span. So we use 10% of 70, we'd get a 7-foot structure depth. Now in final design, that could probably get improved with some more fine detailed engineering. So to answer the question is, we could probably make some improvements later. We're erring a little bit conservatively now to just make sure we're establishing the limits of impacts for all these different alternatives. Second part, there was actually I'm remembering the third part now, was about the Maple and Main. There is the possibility to do that. I don't know if we've established what exactly is going to happen in Maple and Main. I mean, maybe that's something that Bill could touch upon a little bit more. And I think there's another question in there about the grade on the south end of the project, the railroad, to increase the grade. The reason why we can't really raise Main much more than we're currently showing is because of the constraint at Woodside Road. We're beginning the elevation climb just north of the Woodside Road overcrossing. So the project limits are essentially established at Howard Avenue in the north and then Woodside Road on the south. Bill or Jessica, I don't know if you want to talk more about the Maple Main question.
So the question again is, should close and reroute Maple to Elm to get to Main to avoid any need to lower Redwood Creek? So it seems a little bit like, is there a need to lower Redwood Creek? Yeah,
so some of the alternatives would require building a siphon to basically get the water over any new structures that are in the way of the creek. So when you look at maybe, Peter, do you want to go? Actually, I could go to the virtual room.
Yeah, some of the alternatives do show a siphon. I can do that if you want.
Yeah, maybe just show those options, but that's definitely, that's the feedback that we're looking for from the community is, people's willingness to have certain streets like Maple closed, because as you pointed out, having to basically reroute the creek would be very expensive, and it would be like a permanent ongoing maintenance requirement that's really not desirable.
And so just to make a little plug for that blue easel there, that's where the survey is, and those are the kind of questions that are on the survey as well. So those of you who did not join us immediately at the top of the meeting, we do have a live survey, and we encourage you and your family and your colleagues and all to take that survey. It'll be open through the end of the month. Go ahead, Bill, if you wanted to speak to this, or whoever's going to speak to this.
Yeah, I think maybe Peter can outline sort of one of the drawings first.
Yeah, this is the Maple Street exhibit for alternatives 1 and 3. 1 and 3 were combined because the rail elevation difference is roughly the same for both 1 and 3. And then we show here, because of the road getting lowered, we do show a proposed siphon here for the creek. I think the question was if we reroute traffic and essentially close Maple, then we could avoid. Am I understanding the question correctly?
That's the question.
Yeah. So that is a possibility, and we have an alternative here. Let me go back one screen here here we go. On this one here for alternatives 1, 2, and 3, we have a closure of Maple As you can see here, it kind of dead ends here at Pennsylvania and then turns up Pennsylvania. And then we just provide a pedestrian bike undercrossing here at Maple. This avoids any impact to the creek. Let me zoom in on that a little bit more closely. That brown is the undercrossing structure under the tracks. This magenta pink color is the ramps descending down into the tunnel, the ped bike tunnel under the tracks. And you can see the blue dash line is the existing culvert underneath Maple. So we wouldn't be impacting that with this particular alternative.
Okay. I'm going to move us along. The next question is for Jessica. Somebody wants to know if we can really, as a city, afford all of option number 1 or alternative number 1.
Yeah, that's the million or actually billion-dollar question. And so, yeah, the short answer is no, we certainly don't have money for all of that right now. All of these alternatives are extremely expensive and will require funding from every source that's imaginable, you know, whether it's federal, state, regional, or local funding. And we'd expect all those to be helping contribute to the cost of the grade separations. One thing that is working in our favor is the fact that we do have the hub station incorporated into our plans. The fact that that's going to provide a major regional transit benefit opens the project up to funding sources that might not otherwise be available. So that's the good news, but there's no question that these are very expensive projects, and we would have to be pulling a lot of funding from a lot of different sources to be able to afford that.
Okay, the next question is talking about a technical issue related to the number of tracks. And the question is, why do the alternatives not include 4 tracking through the whole of downtown? Seems like that's an important thing for the system's operational performance and resilience. So that seems like maybe Melissa and Jessica, you can both take an answer there. Maybe start with Melissa.
Yeah, so this is one of my sort of long-winded responses, but I think it's an important one. So the adopted Caltrain service vision is based off the moderate growth scenario, as I mentioned earlier. And again, it includes 8 Caltrain trains, 4 high-speed rail trains per direction per hour. And so to support this level of Caltrain and high-speed rail service, a 4-track station is required. And that's primarily to, you know, support transfers between Caltrain Express and local trains and allow high-speed rail trains to pass through. So that is an assumption that was made in this study due to the business plan. But I think, you know, beyond that 4-track station, the business plan, the adopted service vision says that we don't necessarily need 4 tracks for the full length of downtown Redwood City. However, the 4-track question is an interesting one because, as I mentioned before, the business plan investigated a high growth scenario as well. And that high growth scenario, while it was not adopted, you know, the board said, try not to preclude. The high growth scenario, you know, includes 12 Caltrain trains and 4 high-speed rail trains per direction per hour. And as I mentioned, it requires a 4-track infrastructure that spans from north of Hayward Park in San Mateo to south of the Redwood City Station. So this infrastructure is quite extensive. And that's why the business case analysis performed in the Caltrain business plan didn't quite support it. And while staff is not to preclude that infrastructure, it doesn't necessarily mean we're actively planning for it, because this high growth scenario would really only come to fruition in combination with a lot of other regional transportation improvements, like a second Transbay tube, for instance, you know, improvements that are occurring very much into the far future. So that's, you know, me getting around to saying that, you know, we're currently thinking about what that could mean for these existing grade separation designs. and the type of work that we want to do as part of upcoming rail-oriented studies in Redwood City. I think we'll need to delve into what it means to not preclude that 4-track infrastructure across the length of Redwood City. And I think it's possible that this issue will even go back to the JPB for feedback. But this work, the 4-track work under the high growth scenario that we're not supposed to preclude, really shouldn't take place in the grade separation analysis. This study is funded with San Mateo County TA funds specific for grade separations. So it's really most appropriate if we do it in a separate analysis that will be upcoming at some point in the near future. Yeah, so I think that hopefully that gets to the bulk of the complexity of that 4-track question.
And before I throw it to Jessica, just when you say we, you mean the Caltrain we?
Yes, but of course, working with our city partners. I mean, we can't really do any of this work without the support of the city.
Right. Jessica, anything to add there from the city's perspective about 4-tracking through downtown?
Yeah, all I think I would add is just putting a finer point on the fact that, the more space that you take for the railroad tracks, the more potential impacts you have that radiate from the railroad tracks. So as streets have to go farther down to get underneath the tracks if the width of the tracks is wider. So we're just always balancing the sort of the needs of the transit system with the local potential local impacts to property and landowners on either side of those tracks. Because I mean, even when you look at Jefferson, like it has real impacts, and it changes the very nature of the community around those grade crossings. So we want to make sure that we're being as context sensitive as we can.
Okay, I'm going to batch the next 2 questions together, and they're for Melissa, but they could be for both of you. So is the Dumbarton Rail project being considered as part of the grade separation alternatives? What are you doing about that? And also similarly, is high-speed rail being considered as part of the context for this study? So I throw it to Melissa and Jessica to help us understand the answer to those questions.
Sure. Jessica, do you want me to start and you can jump in?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. So I think, in terms of Dumbarton, the city and Caltrain are actively working with Samtrans and the existing Dumbarton Transportation Corridor team to better understand the alternatives that they have on the table currently and how they could potentially interact with the various grade separation options we have on the table. So I think the short answer here is that we're coordinating, but we're going to continue to coordinate. So not a really straightforward answer there, but we're working together. In terms of high-speed rail, as I mentioned before, the grade separation study is based upon the adopted Caltrain service vision. Again, this includes 8 Caltrain trains and 4 high-speed rail trains per direction per hour in 2040. So the grade separation study takes these service levels into consideration when evaluating things like local traffic impacts under the future condition. The grade separation study also, as I mentioned, assumes the need for a 4-track hub station at Redwood City per the adopted service vision. And again, this helps facilitate transfers between Caltrain services, but also it allows high-speed rail trains to pass through unimpeded. I think it's worth noting that high-speed rail is not currently planning to stop in Redwood City. Our agreements with high-speed rail don't involve any stops at Redwood City. And if I think you're interested in any detail about high-speed rail beyond that, I'd encourage you to visit their website, highspeedrail.ca.gov. Thanks.
All right. While we're talking about Caltrain, I've got a few questions that have come in. I'm going to batch these as well. Is the city aware that the grade separations eliminate the 110 mile per hour speed limit currently being envisioned for the peninsula? And does Caltrain understand that non-stopping trains cannot possibly travel at 110 miles per hour on a track immediately adjacent to a platform? And let's see, I thought there was a similar question from the same person, but let's start with those. Melissa.
Sure, and actually maybe I'll just have, check in with Peter here. Peter, the designs as they currently stand accommodate miles, they accommodate 110 miles per hour, correct? Okay, so yeah, our designs currently accommodate that speed. In terms of the second part of that question, sort of going back to the business plan operations analysis, we assumed 110 maximum authorized speed as part of those analyses. But that doesn't actually mean that all the trains would travel at 110 miles per hour, of course. I think it would vary. And I think, again, this is an area where we're really going to have to continue to work with high-speed rail as we contemplate, further designs and any sort of improvements into the future. So something that will definitely be investigated further.
Okay, thank you. The next question is to Jessica. What of the city projects, other city projects would have to be moved lower down the priority list if the city chooses to fund one or more of the expensive alternatives?
Yeah, I mean, at this point, we don't have enough information to be making those types of decisions. What I can say is that for our citywide transportation plan, Redwood City Moves, we identified a list of significant projects. These are basically high cost projects that just sort of live in their own world, and they're really hard to compare to one another. It's like comparing apples and oranges and peaches. So we often sort of examine them on the merits of their own projects. I mean, right now, the only other project, transportation project that we have that's the sort of a similar scale, but it really pales in comparison to this, is the 101-84 interchange project, which is also in the hundreds of millions of dollars for a project cost. So, for example, if you wanted to compare those two, I mean, part of the answer is that they do pull from largely different funding sources. When you look at all of the universe of transportation funding, it's often broken up by mode and types of projects. And so where, we may be funding the interchange project from highway funds, that's not something that the grade separation project would be eligible for. So in that sense, they aren't really competing with each other. Where they could end up competing is how much local funding we contribute to those projects. And ultimately, it's, we develop these projects, and at any point along the way, the city council could decide that, this isn't the best use of city resources, and, take the off ramp and decide this isn't, we don't want to continue pursuing this. But as we go through the project development process, we'll get more information about what the actual costs are and what funding sources are available to the project to get a better sense of how much local funds might be necessary to actually deliver the project. And that's the point where we could have a more detailed conversation about priorities and trade-offs between different projects.
Okay, thank you. The next question relates to potential for cut-through traffic. And the concern is, my concern is in Whipple Avenue grade separation construction is happening. Drivers will cut through the Centennial neighborhood alphabet streets to head north instead of taking El Camino Real. So Bill, is that a logical, or Jessica, is that a logical scenario? And if so, what can we say about that?
I think the primary thing is that my understanding is that there would not, during the construction phase, Whipple would not be closed. It would remain open, and the project would be phased in such a way as there wouldn't be a need to close Whipple. And if I'm not correct in that, Peter perhaps could speak up. But so I don't feel that the problem that was described is actually going to occur. I think that there will be a traffic management plan during the construction to make sure that those kinds of things don't happen. But the main thing is that Whipple would be open during that time.
Jessica, is that your understanding from the city?
Yes. Yeah, we'll be very strategic about how we phase the construction to minimize those impacts. And we're not looking at closing multiple crossings at once. And, as you get into the design, there'll be a lot of detailed analysis about how to do the construction to minimize those traffic impacts.
Great. Peter, anything to add before I move on to the next question?
Nope, you guys covered it.
Okay. This next question, did join us late, and he's apologized for that. And he wanted to know, has or will the city direct the study team to study a fully elevated alternative that eliminates or minimizes impacts to nearby streets, sidewalks, underground utility surprises, and costly relocations, partial or complete, private and public property takings and impacts and such, that the new land underneath the viaduct sections can be created to activate with new uses and or seamlessly connect east-west as it hasn't been since the railroad was built in 1863. So while that was a very long sentence, I think the idea is a very good one. Are you looking at that? Is there an opportunity for that? And how would that work? So Millette or Peter?
I mean, I think I would start with, I think if you notice all of the 4 alternatives that we do have on the table is to elevate the railroad track. And part of that is related to a lot of the things noted in that comment, because when we don't elevate the track and we still have to have the vertical clearance between the track and the local street, we have to lower the railroad track or lower the local road more, which causes utility impacts, impacts to properties and all of those things. So
Great. And again, this person wasn't there in the beginning. We do have a virtual room where all of these materials, and I see that Jessica shared her screen showing that there is an option that does elevate and keep it elevated through most of the city. Did you want to speak to what could happen underneath the elevated system, either Jessica or Melissa?
Well, first, I just wanted to highlight that alternative 1 is really what we're presenting as sort of in many ways, sort of the best case scenario in terms of minimizing impacts to the cross streets. But the challenge is that we have some real constraints, and that a big constraint that that defines these alternatives is the ability to get back underneath the Woodside Road overcrossing. So because the train tracks have to begin descending to get under Woodside Road, those cross streets that are closest to Woodside end up having to be depressed more than we might want them to be. So we're on the northern part of the city. We can really fully elevate the train tracks. We just don't have that option on the southern end because we have to get back under Woodside Road.
Okay. Anything about the reuse underneath? There was a element of that question talking about a possibility of making things more transparent and usable.
Yeah, and certainly all of the alternatives at this point show options for maintaining ped and bike access across the tracks, even if vehicular access would be closed. So that's definitely something that we're keeping in mind. And we heard from our surveys that that's a real priority for the communities to maintain as much connectivity as we can. And to the extent that we can improve the facilities as part of the construction, we will do that. Melissa, do you want to talk? Maybe I'll hand it over to Melissa to talk about options for the actual rail corridor and along the tracks.
Yeah, so one suggestion has come up that is in regard to a potential bike and pedestrian path that could be under an elevated guideway. And I just want to note that this is something that we'd have to look at further. It's essentially a Caltrain property issue. And so I just want to generally remind our public that, recently Caltrain adopted what we call the rail corridor use policy. And it's something that essentially protects Caltrain property and prioritizes it for railroad uses so that we're able to build out the level of service that is envisioned in the Caltrain business plan and in the 2040 service vision. So something like this is a really interesting idea. It just has to go through a process where we evaluate it in terms of the rail corridor use policy. And I think it's something that we'll continue to discuss, certainly.
Thank you. All right, several of these next few things, I've got some comments and I'm just going to read them so people know that we've seen them. Some of them honestly don't really totally make sense. Like this one that here says, "These people, ? Wow. Then another person said, please make the ability to raise the tracks harder. Oh, I think this person is just observing as I think it was typed in while people were talking about the different alternatives, that it makes the ability to raise the tracks harder at a later time. And I think that was probably a point that one of you were making at the time. Here's another one. An anonymous attendee says, thanks for the answers. In the future, please do not disassociate the grade separation project from the very large increase in housing for the Sequoia Station project when discussing traffic. This feels a little dishonest or lacking in transparency, or at least clarify that you are speaking only to the grade separations. So Jessica, did you want to address that one?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as Bill presented, we did a level of service analysis for traffic under basically existing or pre-pandemic conditions, and then also a future analysis. And that future scenario, the year was 2045, and the assumptions that go into that are basically that traffic is growing in the area, and it's essentially compatible with the land use assumptions that are currently on the books. To the extent that new development at Sequoia Station could increase the amount of traffic that's generated at that site, that level of detail would get incorporated into any environmental analysis that's done, both for that project as well as for any future environmental analysis for the grade separation project. But they are very much tied to one another. The benefit of improving transit service in the corridor and for downtown Redwood City is that we'll get more people that are able to choose alternatives to driving themselves. And we've definitely seen that with data we collected in Redwood City Moves, that people who live or work downtown close to the train station drive at much lower rates than people who live outside of the downtown area. So we want to capitalize on that experience and getting more people onto train, transit, and walking and biking. So there are benefits by concentrating development around this train station, as well as more passengers for Caltrain, which helps their bottom line. So it's true that we haven't gotten into sort of a detailed traffic analysis at this point that speaks to the specifics of that development work, but they are very much tied to one another, if only because to build the 4-track station, we need additional space for more tracks and a wider platform. And some of that space would come from the existing Sequoia Station development site.
So that same person, I'm going to batch questions from authors here, wants to know if that this effort would preclude a future BART station in downtown Redwood City.
At this time, I haven't heard of any plans for BART coming to downtown. It would definitely beyond Caltrain and, planning around Dumbarton, adding another rail service would definitely be very challenging. But again, like I haven't heard of that as even an option that's being considered. So at this point, that's not part of our planning.
Okay. And Melissa, I see you nodding as well. Okay. All right, I'm going to batch these next ones. This is from a person who is a retired Caltrain, but I think you meant Caltrain engineer. And I'm going to go ahead and read a couple of these that are somewhat very technical. Alternatives 2 and 3 closes Brewster and Broadway to the detriment of traffic explained earlier. You won't need more than about 5 feet T/R to low steel. Look at Gerald. Can go 2% grade with no impact on operations. Freight impact is minimal. This is a choice by Caltrain on their standards. And at Maple, use better bridge depth and you won't have to lower the grade for the bike underpass. I didn't really see a question in there, but I just wanted to let you know that the team is nodding. They're taking this into account. I do have a couple more questions. I am going a little quickly because, as I mentioned, we're scheduled to go to about 6:30 and we're starting to bump up against that. Question that somebody asked here, which is about costs. When will you have costs? Are there costs between the alternatives? I'm going to throw that to Millette.
Yeah, we have not done detailed costs at this point. I mean, we have, if you go in and look at the evaluation matrix, we've kind of done a general rating of what we think costs the most of the four, which I think is landing on alternative one, as we've already noted. Once we get some of the alternatives narrowed down some more, then we will start developing some planning level type costs to help add to that information available.
Elaine, just to clarify one thing you mentioned earlier, the previous person said they were closing Brewster and Broadway for alternatives 2 and 3. That's not the case. It's for alternative 4 only where we're doing that.
But there are
Thank you.
alternatives where it could be.
So I do want to keep going. There's a question about the timeline. We did cover that already. And again, I would just take this opportunity to say, if you did not join us from the beginning, there are slides available. There also are taped versions of earlier meetings. This is meeting number 3, where we've answered question and answer. The materials are on the website. For those of you who will be logging off soon, I just really encourage you to take that survey. We've been talking about the virtual room. If you were not here at the beginning of the meeting, is rwctransitplan.com. And if you go there, you will be in that room that we keep demoing, and that blue screen there, you can leave additional comments, or you can take our survey. So if you click on that blue easel, you'll be given 2 choices. So please take advantage of that survey. We talked about the BART station. There's a question about quality of life here, Jessica. In what ways does this project protect and promote the well-being of current Redwood City workers and residents of color?
So I would go back to this, just the general benefits of grade separation projects, which is, to increase connectivity across the railroad corridor, to increase safety, to reduce noise associated with the trains. None of these issues get eliminated with grade separations, but they can be improved. And to the extent that we have more people of color living close to the train tracks, they also stand to benefit more from these improvements that are brought about by the grade separations.
Okay, question about why extending BART wouldn't be a better investment to the city than having to pay for this. And again, I don't think there's a proposal to extend BART, but Jessica?
Yeah, again, I think maybe the point here is who's paying for the improvements. And again, regardless of, whether it's a BART or Dumbarton Rail or, additional Caltrain tracks, I mean, a lot of the funding for these types of projects come from sources beyond Redwood City. I think it's very unlikely that Redwood City itself would be footing a majority of the cost of any of these options, whether it's BART or Caltrain or Dumbarton. Like, they'd be coming from federal and state funding sources, private contributions. So I don't know that changing the technology would necessarily take any sort of financial contribution from the city off of the table. But again, like, there are no plans to extend BART down here at this point.
And this person makes the observation in a different comment that they ask because BART goes to many more places with stops around the Bay Area than Caltrain does. Okay, I wanted to get into this idea again about 4-track. We've covered some of this, but we've got a few questions here that are going there. Bringing the Dumbarton line would be greatly helped if it were 4 tracks from the station to the existing 4 tracks at Woodside. And then someone else is saying, I'm going to batch these together and have Melissa address these. If the 4-track section is limited only to the station, can you explain how express trains can efficiently and reliably overtake locals at the station without excessive delays to the local train being overtaken? It seems that even for a moderate growth scenario, a 2-station long 4-track section is needed.
So I can't get into too many of the specifics, but we can potentially take it offline. But the business plan operations analysis did look at all of that and basically ended up saying that it's completely feasible for the transfer of, folks in between express and local trains at Redwood City without a lot of delay. If you're interested in the details of that, I can say you can email me and I can maybe type my email into the box tonight. And I can get some further detail for you on that. But I do know that the business plan, in summary, said it works with a 4-track hub station to serve the moderate growth service level.
Okay, thank you. And this might be another one to take offline. There was a comment that you, Melissa, did not fully answer the 2 questions about the speed limit. So if there was something more you wanted to add, this person's asking me to reread those questions. And I think since we're over time and I've got new topics, I'm gonna, maybe you could take that offline or maybe do a reiteration of what this person might be.
Sure. Well, I guess I think the main comment was that the grade separations would essentially not allow for train speeds of 110 miles per hour. According to our analysis, it should. That doesn't necessarily mean that trains will travel through at 110 miles per hour, but certainly, again, something that we're going to be looking into more as we continue to work with high-speed rail.
Okay. Should the transit and Sequoia Station projects proceed without more of this analysis? So that sounds like a Jessica question.
Yeah, we're doing the analysis. We're doing analysis for the grade separations in conjunction with analysis for the transit district. So in some respects, they are going in parallel. I think what's worth understanding those, the grade separation project impacts, we sort of limit to limit for the city, whereas the transit district is focused in the downtown area, as is the Sequoia Station redevelopment. So there's overlap between the work that's going on between grade separations and transit district, but not everything that's being done for the grade separation is necessarily directly relevant to the transit district work. But we are, all of this work is being coordinated between the transit improvements, transportation impacts, as well as the development work. So all that is being done in a coordinated way.
Okay, we've got a question here. Why have trains going through Redwood City on an elevated structure if they're not going to stop there? Have you considered a 2-track at-grade alternative with passing tracks and tunnels under the existing tracks? Have we looked at that? I guess I would throw that to Millette and Peter. Question is, if we've got, why are all the things going through it elevated if they're not going to stop there? Have you considered a 2-track at-grade station alternative with passing tracks and tunnels under the existing?
Well, do you want to take that? You're muted.
And then while you're doing that, the person asked or made the point that grade separations make it possible to go through a crossing at speeds in excess of 125 miles an hour. And this person is saying BART is at 70 miles an hour and expensive and also not compatible with high-speed rail. So I think that person was answering the question of the other person. But if we can get Millette to talk about whether you've looked at the option that's just being put out there about the at grade 2-track and then something in a tunnel.
No, we have not looked at that option. We've not looked at that.
Okay, here's a technical question. To avoid or reduce lowering Chestnut, why can't the tracks start rising somewhere south of the Woodside overpass as there is sufficient excess vertical clearance under Woodside to do so? Peter?
I don't believe that's the case. I believe the clearance under the Woodside structure cannot be reduced, but even if it could, we're probably not talking very much. I mean, that's something we could maybe follow up on to verify.
Yeah, I mean, remember with Woodside is going over the railroad tracks, right? So the vertical clearance required for that is much higher than what the road goes under. So it may appear, it definitely is higher, but that's because not only when the track goes, or when the road goes over the track, it also has to clear all the electrification and things like that. So those requirements require much more vertical clearance between the tracks and the roadway than when you do it the other way around, when the roadway goes underneath the tracks.
And I would just chime in too, the other constraint that we're dealing with is the spur track that goes out to the port of Redwood City. And if we elevate if the tracks are elevated more, then we have the potential of impacting those tracks. And so again, the impact radiates away from the Caltrain corridor and towards the tracks, having to rebuild tracks out towards the port.
Great. Well, we've gotten great questions here tonight. I want to appreciate that person rewriting in about the question that I had about the comment. So that was a syntax thing back towards me. So I saw that. So if we can just remind everyone, the survey will be up through the end of the month. This meeting will arrive on the website in about a week. It is being taped, but we do find that it takes a bit to get processed and then placed on the website. We appreciate all your great questions. As was asked earlier, we do go ahead and transfer all the questions that you ask that we answer. We put them out on the website as a frequently asked questions document where you see your question and then the answer. So those are available for previous meetings as well as we'll be doing one for this evening's meeting. And again, thank you for attending. We had very good attendance with people hanging in there till the last question. So we appreciate that very much. So with that, we stand adjourned, and again, thank you for participating, and we look forward to seeing you at the next one. Good night.
Thank you.